Chapter 10. My father never stopped hating Jews. He hated everybody, but at least he stopped being so openly anti-Semitic after Solomon Adler, Paul's father, hired him to work at the Blue Diamond coal mine. Paul must have begged his father, we all knew it, and if anything, my father hated the Adlers even more for that perceived charity. But he took the job and kept his mouth shut. After all, he was getting older, and his best boxing days were behind him. But mine were just beginning. After a hard week in the mines, my father would take his ugly son to the prize fights and make his drinking money on side bets. I didn't win. I wasn't supposed to. "This time, you go down in the 4th round," he said. "Do you hear me? Round 4, say it." "But I can win," I said, earning myself a hard slap. I could have ducked it, but it would have just made him angrier. Besides, he didn't hit as hard as he thought anymore. The slap was nothing. I stared at him, 17 years of hate in my eyes. "Round 4, say it." "Round 4, I said. He pushed me into the ring, and I took my beating. He made less and less by having me throw the fight. The odds got worse with every loss. I'm sure some of the low-life idiots who let my father hang around were on to him. If he'd had any faith in me at all, he'd have realized it would be better to have me win some. So I ducked, I slipped, I parried, and I took enough hits to make it look convincing when I eventually went down, but I made sure to get a few good hits in along the way. I needed them to know, my opponents. I needed them to at least worry that this might be the day that Frank Shepard Jr. finally cut loose and put them down. Even more, I needed to see my father sweat. I needed to glance over to the corner and see him worrying that I might land too many hits, that I might knock some poor kid out before I got to my own appointment with the floor. Most of all, I wanted him to worry about what I could do to him. In my head, it was always him in the ring with me. I never saw any of that money. Why should I? In his eyes, I was his property, not his protégé. No different than a dog he'd fight into the grave. He drank it all. It was worth it, though, because it kept his attention on me and away from Maggie and our mother. Maggie was popular in school. At 12 years old, she was a lovely red-headed girl with a disarming smile and infectious laugh, facts that seemed to overcome our poverty and opened the door to friendships with half the school. She was still friendly with Paul Adler, but her popular friends weren't much more accepting of the Jewish kid than they were of the hare-lip with holes in his clothes. Paul was one of the only people who talked to me. I suppose that made him my friend, but I'd just as soon have kept to myself. The other students stopped teasing me after I started boxing. I was always coming to school with new bruises and cuts. I was clearly somebody who got in a lot of fights, and as I grew, I was treated with less contempt and more fear. I was almost grateful for my father for giving me a new story to explain my cleft lip. I don't think anybody ever believed that I'd been kicked by a horse. By this time, the scar on my cleft lip wasn't as prominent as it had been as a small child. It would always be there, but the small line and the hint of a snarl were now just a part of my face, instead of its defining feature. It's strange what you can grow into. I did Maggie a favor in public and kept my distance from her as well. She'd never have asked me to do this, but I knew that I wouldn't be doing her popularity any favors by reminding people that I was her brother. I still watched over her, but from a distance. I watched as the boys started to look at Maggie differently, admiringly, the way a hungry cat admires a bird. More than once I chased older boys away from my 12-year-old sister. I spent my free time alone in the forest when the weather permitted, and sometimes even when it didn't. I was always borrowing books from the library. I loved Jack London and Rudyard Kipling, but I wasn't picky. I read almost anything I could get my hands on. I was especially fond of dime novels and pulp magazines, especially escapist adventure books like Argosy and Detective Story magazine, which I'd read under a tree on some Mondays or even Tuesdays when I'd cut school until the swelling on my face would go down after a weekend fight. I came honestly by my habit of escaping life in the pages of a book. Our mother spent hours poring over old novels. She loved her Bronte and her Austen, but disapproved of my common trash magazines. She threw them away, at least until I learned to hide them better. One of the only other things she seemed to care about was church. Father Riley says was the beginning to half of the things she said to us, and the only times she missed Mass were when she couldn't hide a fresh bruise or a swollen lip from our father. In addition to prayer and novels, she found her comfort in her medicine. I didn't have my mother's faith or love for the church. I don't think I ever did. Perhaps there was a time when I was a very small child that I blindly trusted the adults who told me about the garden and the fall and the flood and Jesus and the saints and all of it. But I can't remember ever seeing it as more than just another story that my mother sought comfort from. Maybe it comes from having a father that I hated. I could understand the concept of God as a father to be feared. Floods and plagues sounded fairly fatherly to me. But the idea of worshipping the mean son of a bitch for it never made any sense to me. Just give me my beating and be damned, but don't expect me to thank you for it. Mother and Maggie attended all the services faithfully, but our father had other plans for me. Our weekends were sacrosanct. That was when I played Isaac to his Abraham, when he offered his son as a sacrifice to the gods of liquor and cash. But no angel of the Lord ever appeared to save me and have a ram take my place in the ring. Father had his alcohol and whores, Mother her priests and her medicine, Maggie had her friends and her faith. I had my books and my trees. As they always do, things changed. War had been raging in Europe, and more there was talk of America throwing her hat into the ring. The temperance movement and those damned Protestants were pushing for a dry and sober America, and people seemed to like the idea. Washington State was an early adopter of Prohibition, and my father had to turn to illegally bootlegged Canadian whiskey as the saloons were shut down and driven underground. He and a lot of the other miners spent more and more time with the bootleggers after the Blue Diamond coal mine played itself out and closed down. Eventually I was done with school. I'd have loved nothing better than to get as far away from my parents as possible, but there was Maggie to think of. I got a job working at the cannery and came home each evening smelling bad and feeling worse. But I kept my mother and sister fed, since our father seemed not to give a damn anymore. That spring, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, and they gave it to him. Mother didn't like it. Her father had been from Germany, and she spoke enough of the language that Maggie and I both had picked up a fair amount of it when we were small. Our father had been a soldier once, before I'd been born, and he talked a lot about how he'd love to sign up and go over and fight the Hun. He talked a lot about how ashamed he was that his son wasn't eager to go do his part and uphold his good name. I didn't bother to point out to him that I was now the only one putting food on the table. It would only have earned me a fresh beating. I was still too young to be drafted, but in another year that would no longer be the case. I stayed up at night worrying about what would happen to my mother and sister if I was conscripted and sent off to war. I couldn't leave them alone with him. Jobless, we saw more and more of our father around the house. He didn't have enough money to spend as much time as he'd like at the brothels and bars, but he stole a good portion of what I brought home and used it for just that purpose when he could. Mother's looks had faded a bit over the years. She'd always been a beautiful woman. Her figure and the same fiery red hair that she'd passed on to her children had always turned heads. Maybe it was the medicine, maybe it was the beatings, maybe it was just the years. But she wasn't beautiful anymore. She was just tired, sad, and dim. A shadow of who she used to be. She didn't turn anybody's heads anymore. Not even our father's. He'd been looking elsewhere for years. At whores, at strangers, and finally, in 1917, he started to look at Maggie. I caught him one day, unshaven and smelling of cheap liquor, admiring her through the washroom window. Admiring her in that same way that he'd stare thirstily at a cold beer.